What would you do when the line between reality and nightmare disappears? Lucas's quiet, ordinary life shatters the moment he receives a cryptic text from his best friend camping deep in the mountains. At first, it seems like a joke, a scarecrow standing still in the wilderness. But as the texts continue, something darker begins to unfold. The scarecrow is no longer just an object. It's watching, it's waiting, and Lucas can feel it creeping closer. Why are you scared yet? The question taunts him, haunting his every waking moment. As his world unravels, Lucas spirals into paranoia, trapped in a suffocating web of fear and isolation. Shadows move when they shouldn't. Eerie figures appear and vanish, and reality itself begins to twist around him. Desperate for answers, he ventures into the mountains, searching for his missing friend, only to find that the true horror may not be out there, but within his own mind. No one can be trusted, not even himself. With every step, the scarecrows multiply, watching, stalking, hunting. Lucas must confront the terror head-on, but as his sanity crumbles, the question remains, what's real? Or is this nightmare all in his head? In this video, escape is an illusion. The mind is the ultimate horror, and Lucas is running out of time. Lucas sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring at his phone as the first text from Marcos flashed on the screen. Weird scarecrow out here. Looks like someone's idea of a joke. Lucas chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head. Marcos had always had a strange sense of humor. Still, something about the message lingered in his mind. The casual tone didn't match the unease he felt stirring in his chest. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself that he was overthinking again. But the image of that scarecrow, alone in the wilderness, kept creeping back into his thoughts. Hours later, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling. The message nagged at him, its strangeness more profound than he'd initially realized. He reread it several times, each repetition pulling him deeper into a strange sense of discomfort. "It's nothing," he muttered, pushing his phone away. The quietness of the apartment felt too heavy now, as though something was pressing down on him. Shadows shifted against the walls, though the light hadn't changed. He glanced toward the window, half expecting to see something moving outside, but nothing stirred. Only his reflection looked back, his face pale and drawn. When the second message came, Lucas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "It's closer now," it read. "I don't know why, but it feels like it's watching me." Lucas frowned, staring at the screen in disbelief. Marcos had never been one for fear or exaggeration. Camping alone in the mountains was his favorite pastime, and he'd always handled it with ease. But something in the tone of this message felt different, off. Lucas typed a response quickly, asking if everything was okay, but his fingers trembled as he pressed send. The apartment felt colder, the silence growing louder, like a dull hum in the background. Minutes passed, and no reply came. Lucas tried to focus on his work, but the unease kept gnawing at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. His thoughts circled back to the text, replaying Marcos's words over and over. He checked his phone again, hoping for an update, but the screen remained blank. The silence of his apartment seemed to deepen, stretching the walls around him. For the first time in years, Lucas felt genuinely afraid, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Lucas's sleep that night was restless, disturbed by dreams of faceless figures standing at the edge of the forest. When he awoke in the morning, his phone buzzed with another message from Marcos. "It's not a joke anymore. It's still here, watching." Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He tried calling Marcos, but the line rang out, unanswered. The growing silence from his friend, once merely a strange inconvenience, was now oppressive. Something was wrong. The text felt more real, more urgent, each one adding weight to the fear settling in Lucas's mind. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Marcos had poor service, or maybe he was just messing with him. But that didn't explain the tension gnawing at his chest. As the day passed, Lucas found it increasingly difficult to focus. His thoughts drifted, consumed by the strange messages and the vivid, unsettling image of a scarecrow standing in the middle of the wilderness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, even though everything in his life remained seemingly normal. At work, he fumbled through tasks, barely keeping up with conversations. The dull hum of the office did little to distract him from the gnawing fear that had taken root in his mind. Each time his phone buzzed, his heart raced. Another text arrived. "I don't think it's a scarecrow anymore." Lucas's hands shook as he read the words, his pulse quickening. What could Marcos mean? The more he thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. What else could it be? His mind scrambled for answers, but none came. He tried calling Marcos again, but the call went straight to voicemail. The mounting frustration was almost unbearable now, his chest tight with a suffocating sense of dread. Lucas's thoughts spiraled out of control as he imagined what might be happening to his friend. The line between fear and reason blurred. By evening, Lucas's world felt distorted, like the air around him had thickened, trapping him in a reality where nothing made sense. His apartment, once a safe haven, now felt like a prison. The lights flickered occasionally, casting fleeting shadows on the walls that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. He tried to distract himself by turning on the TV, but the noise felt abrasive, too loud. He turned it off after a few minutes, the silence swallowing him whole. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, and Lucas realized with growing horror that the fear was starting to seep into him. The next day, Lucas found himself staring out the window for hours, scanning the quiet street below. His phone sat heavy in his hand, every buzz making his heart leap. The texts had stopped coming, but the fear remained, lodged deep in his chest. He kept checking his phone, waiting for Marcos to respond. Every time it buzzed, he hoped for some clarity, but each time it was just another mundane notification, nothing from his friend. The absence of those disturbing messages should have brought relief, but it only made the silence more unbearable. Lucas felt disconnected from reality, like his world had shifted into something darker. That night, Lucas dreamed again. This time, the scarecrows had faces, stitched, grotesque expressions that leered at him from the edges of his mind. When he awoke, drenched in sweat, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching him from the shadows of his room. He sat up, eyes darting to the corners, convinced he saw something move. But the room was empty. It was always empty, except for the nagging sense that he was not alone. His apartment, once a place of refuge, had become a maze of shadows and whispers, each corner holding something unseen, something wrong. The following day, Lucas caught sight of something from the corner of his eye, a shape standing near the window. His breath caught in his throat as he turned, but there was nothing. He told himself it was just a trick of the light, a reflection. But the more he thought about it, the less sure he became. His mind felt foggy, reality slipping through his fingers like sand. He started avoiding the mirrors, the windows, anything that might show him what he didn't want to see. But no matter how hard he tried to block it out, the fear always crept back in, relentless. When another text finally came, Lucas's hands trembled as he opened it. "Why are you scared yet?" It was a simple question, but the words sent a chill through his entire body. He stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what it meant. The question lingered in his mind, twisting and warping his sense of reason. Was it a joke? A warning? Or something worse? Lucas could no longer tell. He typed a response, but his fingers hesitated over the screen. His world had shifted again, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what came next. Lucas couldn't sleep after that last message. His mind spun with possibilities, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. The world outside his apartment felt distant, like a memory slowly fading away. Inside, the silence was deafening, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through him. He kept replaying Marcos's words in his head. "Why are you scared yet?" A question that seemed to mock him, as though something unseen knew his every thought. Lucas began pacing the small space, feeling the walls close in around him. As days passed, Lucas's reality seemed to distort further. The lights in his apartment flickered more frequently, and he swore the shadows on the walls were growing darker, more pronounced. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, but the feeling of being watched was constant now, suffocating. Every time he looked outside, it felt like the world had shifted. Colors seemed duller, sounds more muted. The streets were empty, devoid of life. He wondered if the rest of the world even existed anymore, or if he was trapped in this strange, isolating nightmare. Lucas stopped responding to friends and coworkers, retreating further into his apartment. He checked his phone obsessively, waiting for more texts from Marcos, but none came. The silence between the messages gnawed at him, filling his mind with dread. He tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe Marcos had lost service, or maybe it was all a sick joke. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, something far beyond his understanding. His grip on reality was slipping, and the more he tried to hold on, the more it seemed to unravel. Then, one night, as Lucas sat staring at the dark screen of his phone, it buzzed again. His heart raced as he read the new message. It wasn't from Marcos. It was from an unknown number, and it read, "I'm here." The words sent a wave of cold fear through him. He looked around the room, panic rising in his chest. Who was here? What did they want? The silence felt oppressive, and for the first time, Lucas wondered if the danger wasn't just in the mountains with Marcos, but right there, in his apartment, lurking in the shadows. Lucas's mind raced, searching for an explanation. Who had sent the message? Why had the Scarecrow appeared so clearly in his dreams, as if it were alive, waiting? The unsettling realization that something or someone was toying with him made his skin crawl. He checked the locks on his door 3 times, then again, feeling like no amount of security could protect him from whatever was out there. The unknown number remained on his phone, staring back at him, mocking his growing fear. He wanted to call someone for help, but his isolation had become so complete that no one would understand. Later that night, Lucas sat in the dark, the only light coming from his phone. He scrolled back through the text from Marcos, noticing something odd: the timestamps. Some of them were sent at times when Marcos should have been out of service, deep in the mountains. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. It didn't make sense. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Marcos had found a way to send messages without him realizing. But another part of him, the part that had been growing more paranoid by the day, whispered a darker truth. What if the texts weren't from Marcos at all? His heart pounded as he considered the possibility. Had someone or something been sending him these messages all along? His mind raced through a dozen explanations, but none of them provided comfort. He couldn't shake the growing sense that he was being manipulated, that the Scarecrow wasn't just a figment of Marcos's imagination. It was real, and it was here, creeping into every corner of Lucas's life. He tried to call Marcos one last time, but the line was dead. His heart sank. Marcos was gone, and Lucas was alone, trapped in this nightmare. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, his phone buzzed once more. The message was simple, chilling. "I'm waiting." Lucas stared at the screen, frozen in place. The words seemed to pulsate in the dark, taunting him. Whoever or whatever was behind this had been watching him all along. He had no idea what to do next. His mind spun, trying to grasp the situation, but the more he thought about it, the less real everything seemed. Was this his reality now? Or had he already crossed the line into madness? The next morning, Lucas made a decision. He had to go to the mountains. He had to find Marcos, or at least whatever was left of him. He packed a bag, though his hands trembled with fear the entire time. The idea of going to that remote, isolated place filled him with dread. But staying in his apartment, haunted by invisible forces, was worse. The unknown was suffocating, and he felt like he was drowning in it. Maybe if he went to where it all started, he'd find some answers. Maybe the text would stop, or maybe he'd lose himself entirely. Lucas's drive to the mountains was long and silent. The air felt heavier as he approached the last known location Marcos had texted him from. Every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last, and the world outside his car felt distant, like a dream. When he finally arrived at the campsite, the scene that greeted him was worse than he'd imagined. There was no sign of Marcos, only a single scarecrow standing eerily in the clearing. It wore Marcos's jacket. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. His worst fears were coming true. The scarecrow stood perfectly still, yet it felt as though its stitched eyes were watching him. Lucas's hands shook as he approached the scarecrow, the world around him closing in. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He reached out and touched the fabric of the jacket, but the moment he did, he recoiled. It felt wrong, like it wasn't just a piece of clothing, but something alive, pulsing beneath his fingers. He stumbled back, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. He needed to leave, now. But as he turned to run, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Marcos's phone. "Why did you run?" Lucas's blood turned to ice. He looked around, panic surging through him. Was it watching him? Was it closer than he thought? The shadows seemed to stretch, moving toward him as though they were alive. He backed away, feeling the terror tighten around his chest. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped, caught between the fear of what he couldn't see and the dread of losing his mind completely. The scarecrow stood silently, watching. Lucas's world collapsed in on itself. Lucas's breath came in shallow, panicked bursts as he stood in the clearing, the scarecrow looming over him like a silent sentinel. The wind whipped through the trees, but to Lucas, it felt like whispers carried on the air, mocking him, drawing him further into fear. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot, frozen by the terror consuming him. The message from Marcos's phone still burned in his mind. Why did you run? He hadn't run. He couldn't. It was as if the scarecrow itself was holding him there, binding him with invisible threads of dread. The phone buzzed again, and Lucas's heart leapt into his throat. Another message. You can't hide. The words seemed to crawl across the screen, burrowing into his mind. Lucas looked around frantically, half expecting to see figures moving between the trees. But the forest remained empty. Still, he felt their presence, unseen eyes watching him, waiting for him to break. He stumbled backward, his mind spinning out of control. Was this real? Or had he already lost himself to the madness? Every shadow, every breath of wind felt like it was closing in, suffocating him. Lucas tried to think rationally, tried to grasp at any shred of logic. But the world around him was unraveling too quickly. The scarecrow's stitched smile seemed to widen, though Lucas knew it was impossible. Yet, the fear in his chest told him otherwise. It was watching him, taunting him. He backed away, the world blurring around him as if reality itself was slipping through his fingers. His mind was cracking under the pressure, splintering like glass. Was it the scarecrow? Or was it something deeper? Something inside of him twisting his perception of reality? His phone buzzed one last time, and Lucas's trembling fingers almost dropped it as he glanced down at the screen. It's too late. The message was simple, but the weight of it crushed him. He fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sense that he had crossed a line he could never come back from. The Scarecrow stood motionless in the clearing, but to Lucas, it was no longer just an object. It was alive, it was watching, and it had been waiting for him all along. The shadows deepened, and Lucas felt himself slipping further into the darkness. Lucas forced himself to stand, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him. He couldn't stay here, couldn't let the Scarecrow, or whatever it was, trap him any longer. His thoughts raced, but they were disjointed, fractured like the reality he had once known. He had to get out of the mountains, find some way to escape before the madness consumed him completely. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something horrifying. There, at the edge of the forest, stood another Scarecrow, identical to the first, watching him. Its presence sent a jolt of panic through him. He turned again, and another Scarecrow stood behind him as if it had appeared from the very shadows. Lucas's pulse quickened, his breath shallow and erratic. They were surrounding him. He spun in circles, eyes wide with terror, watching as more Scarecrows emerged from the trees, their burlap faces grinning at him, their stitched eyes following his every move. Lucas's mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. He couldn't tell where they had come from, couldn't understand how they had appeared so suddenly. The forest had come alive, and it was hunting him. Desperate, Lucas stumbled toward his car, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he neared it, the Scarecrows seemed to close in, forming a wall between him and his only means of escape. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced down in horror. There's no escape. The message sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over him. Lucas's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Were they real? Or was his mind conjuring them, feeding off the fear that had been growing inside him for days? The line between reality and delusion blurred beyond recognition. As the Scarecrows closed in, Lucas felt his sanity slipping away completely. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the empty mountains, but no one answered. The Scarecrows stood in silent witness to his breakdown, their faces frozen in grotesque, mocking smiles. Lucas backed up, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to keep hold of what little remained of his sanity. But the truth was undeniable. He had already lost. The Scarecrows weren't just in the forest. They were in his mind, and there was no escaping them. By the time Lucas reached the clearing again, his body was trembling, his mind unraveling faster than he could comprehend. The Scarecrows were everywhere, their stitched eyes following him with every step. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. Lucas felt the weight of the impending night pressing down on him, suffocating him with the certainty that once darkness fell, there would be no turning back. His breaths were ragged, his chest tight with fear. He couldn't tell if he was still in the real world or if he had fallen completely into his own mind. He collapsed to the ground, exhausted, defeated. The phone slipped from his hand, the messages blurring in his vision. "It's over," the final text read. Lucas's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sound. He wanted to fight back, wanted to escape the horror that surrounded him, but his mind was too far gone. The Scarecrows loomed above him now, their faces twisted into nightmarish grins. He closed his eyes, unable to face the grotesque reality that had consumed him. There was no escape. There never had been. As the darkness settled over the mountains, Lucas lay still, his mind fractured beyond repair. The Scarecrows stood sentinel, silent witnesses to his final collapse. His thoughts spiraled into a void, consumed by the overwhelming terror that had plagued him from the beginning. He had lost the battle against his own mind, and now there was nothing left but the cold, empty silence. In the distance, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a voice. Lucas couldn't hear it, but the Scarecrows remained, watching, waiting. And then, nothing. The world faded into black, and Lucas was gone. His phone lay discarded in the dirt, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. The last message blinked once before disappearing forever. "I'm here." The mountains were silent again, the scarecrows standing motionless in the clearing, their task complete. Lucas's descent into madness was over, but the darkness remained, waiting for its next victim. In the end, there was no escaping the terror within. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for Lucas to succumb.